He had noticed it after the wedding and more specifically on the ship back to Lannisport, but had let it be thinking that once they reached home, John would pull himself out of the funk he'd gotten into. When they had arrived at the Rock, he was pleased to see that just being around Joy seemed to bring the boy back to his normal self. However, as the days went on, he realized that was not the truth. While he was happy on the outside, something was clearly bothering him, and Jaime had begun to worry about him more and more. As he got dressed and headed down for their spar, he thought on whether or not he should bring it up, or should he give John more time, and perhaps the boy would bring it up himself. Garion and Tyrion had both noticed, and even his Aunt Jenna had commented, which had made his heart swell to see her care for John as much as the rest of the family did. He knew that was partly due to her sons enjoying having an older boy put them through their paces in the yard. Tion and Walder, along with Martin and Willem, had formed a tight little grouping, and unlike Lancel, who ignored them, John pointed things out to them and had taken to sparring with them occasionally, much to their delight. He stepped out of the lift and walked to the courtyard to find John standing there waiting for him, sword in hand, and smiled. Even with whatever it was that was on his mind, John always turned up for his lessons. He looked around to see where Ghost was. The little wolf had lately decided sneaking up on him was a fun new game, and more than once he'd scared the life out of him. He saw him thankfully sitting by the wall, although he too looked a little bit sadder than usual. "Morning, John. You're eager. I see. I am, my lord." John said, his smile true, but less full than usual. "Good, then shall we begin?" Jaime moved into position and waited for John to attack. The sword came quickly at him, and he blocked it before moving to the left and attacking quickly. John's defense had gotten much better during their time together. His movement and placement of his feet were always incredible, but the way he now used Jaime's strikes against him to limit the power advantage he had was something he was very proud of. They moved together, blades crossing, their movement speeding up. Jaime still had the edge on John in terms of speed, but the boy was faster than he had been at that age, and it was only a matter of time until Jaime's technique and power would be his only advantages against him. At first, John had reminded Jaime of Rhaegar. His ability to absorb the lessons and incorporate them into his form was startling. But the more they sparred, the more he saw Arthur in him. As good as Jaime was, Arthur was a once-in-a-generation swordsman, and he felt, no he knew, that John would be one too. However, for now, he was still a young boy, fighting against the greatest swordsman in Westeros. And as they danced, Jaime's strikes were having their effect. "You're tiring, John," Jaime said with a smirk. "So are you, my lord," John replied. But I could go for a few more hours. Don't think you could," Jaime said, and was surprised to see the frown on John's face. Usually, they snarked at each other during their spars. Jaime wanted John to be prepared for people trying to take him off balance with comments and digs, so between them they would try to get a reaction out of one another. But here, for some reason, John wasn't playing along, and it bothered him greatly. He decided to end the spar and speak to him. This needed to be resolved. "Let's take a break, John." "My lord?" John said, confusion in his voice. "Come, let's get a drink and speak for a while." Jaime turned and walked to the jug of water they kept off to the side. It took a few moments, but eventually John joined him. Placing his sword on the small wall, he sat down and took a drink of the water. The two sat there in silence for what seemed to be an age before Jaime had finally had enough. "John, what's wrong?" "Nothing," John said grumpily. "John, this is me you're speaking to. Come on, talk to me." I don't know what it is, my lord," John sighed. "Ever since the trip to Old Town, I just feel, I don't know, but it's as if what I do will never matter. People will always see me as a bastard." "You're more than that, John, much more," Jaime said, reaching out to grab the boy's shoulder. Look at me, you're more than that, do you hear me? He grabbed the boy and hugged him tightly. He could feel him sobbing against his chest, and it made him want to tell him the truth, to just grab him and take him to his things, show him his birthright and his mother's letter. But he couldn't, not yet. He needed to be sure they were ready, and as much as it hurt to see John like this, he knew it was for the best to wait. After standing there for a while, he finally felt the sobs stop. He let go of the boy and allowed him to turn and wipe his eyes, knowing the embarrassment he'd feel to have cried so openly. It took a few moments, but eventually John turned to him and smiled, this one much fuller than earlier. He knew he had only fixed things temporarily, but he had fixed them, and they both left in much better spirits than they arrived. John woke up excited. Today was a special day, and he was looking forward to it more than any he had in a long while. As he quickly dressed, he saw a ghost was already at the door, almost eagerly waiting to get down to Joy's room. He smiled, and they walked down to the little girl's room. They had a whole day set aside, and everyone was in on the surprises they had in store for Joy's name day. When he entered the room, he found that not only was Joy already up, but she was also already dressed and was having her hair combed, both to his surprise and her annoyance. "No, Asa, ouch," Joy said, and he giggled. "Jan, stop ouch, please," she said when she noticed him. "I'll take it from here." "Alessia, it seems the little princess does not want her hair combed today." "Lord Jerian wants her prepared, John," Alessia said, looking to him. "It's fine, Alessia. Why don't you go break your fast? I'll finish it. If you're sure. Bye, Joy, John." Bye, Asa." He walked over to the bed and sat down, grabbing the comb, which Joy looked at like it was a mortal enemy. "No, Jan. Ouch. Ouch," she said, shaking her head. "It'll be fine, princess. And when we're finished, we can go on an adventure. All right, you, me, and Ghost." He smiled at her. "Ost come, Jan? I will promise. Promise." She looked at him for a moment before looking to the comb and then to Ghost. Finally, she seemed to give in and he began to comb her hair. He was as gentle as he could be, but her hair was tangled and he could feel the comb begin to catch, so he did the only thing he could to keep her mind off the evil comb. He nodded to Ghost, and the wolf jumped up onto the bed. Joy immediately grabbed him, and the two began to play together. He finally finished combing her hair and placed the comb back on the table. It was time to take her in to break their fast, and Jerian would be waiting to start the day off with the first surprise. "Ready, Joy?" "Yeti." He took the girl's hand and they made their way from the room. As they walked, he swung her hand, much to her delight. Ghost toddled in front of them, lost in his own world, occasionally looking back at them as if to say, "Come on, hurry up." When they reached the dining room, they found Jerian sitting there waiting for them. "Papa," the little girl shouted as she ran to him. "Morning, princess. Happy name day," Jerian said, giving her a big hug. John sat down beside him at the table and Joy immediately moved into his lap. He laughed. It was going to be one of those mornings. The meal came and he helped her to eat hers, which she actually did this morning, although she didn't really allow him to eat his own, as she grabbed the bacon and sausages and fed them to an eager wolf. "Ost more," as she fed him some bacon. "Ost more," and there goes a sausage. John was forced to get a second plate, which he left on Jerian's side of the table just out of her reach, although the hungry little wolf had no such trouble, and when his food supply from Joy was gone, he quickly moved over to where John's plate was and looked up at him eagerly. "Traitor," John said, laughing as he threw the wolf some bacon. Ghost just swallowed it and gave him a look that showed cared not a jot. When they finished the meal, they headed down to the lift, Jerian carrying Joy while he and Ghost walked in front of them, keeping the girl amused. It was time to give Joy the first surprise of her name day. It had taken him a long time to convince both Jerian and Jenna that this would be safe, and only because of his connection with Winter had they eventually agreed. Stepping out into the castle's yard, they walked to the stable where Winter had already been prepared. John immediately jumped up and waited for Geryon to hand him the little girl. "Want to ride on the horsey, Joy?" Geryon asked. "Horsey, Papa," Joy said excitedly. Although John thought that was just her natural love of horses and not because she knew what her father had asked. Something which was confirmed a little later when Geryon began to place her on the horse in front of John. Her face was something John would never forget. She was more than happy. She was overjoyed, and it made his heart swell to see it, something he could see. Geryon was feeling too. "Papa, horsey," she exclaimed as John allowed Winter to slowly walk. They rode down the length of the yard and turned around before heading down to the joust practice area, Geryon walking alongside them just in case anything went wrong. But John held her firmly, and Winter was calm and in control. When they reached the practice field, John saw Jenna with her children, and Kevin's 2 boys were sitting down to their left and smiling at them. "Wave to Aunt Jenna, Joy," he said as the little girl did exactly that. John looked at Geryon and he was given a nod, so he pushed Winter into a trot which had the desired effect. Joy's laughter was heard around the field, and even though he couldn't really see her face, he could picture it in his mind, and that was more than enough. Eventually they stopped, and he made his way over to where Geryon was standing. "Go to Papa, Joy." "No, yon horsey. More horsey later." "All right." Joy accepted this thankfully, and after Geryon had taken her from the saddle, he led Winter back to allow her to cool down. The horse had done amazingly well, and he was very proud of his mare. "Good girl. So Carol wheeze," he said as he patted her while she drank from the trough. The rest of the day was a bit of a blur. Geryon had arranged a fool to come and entertain them. But Joy didn't like the man, and he was quickly sent away. She and the rest of the children playing games instead, while John helped when needed. Finally, it was time for Joy to get her presents, and John watched as Geryon went to pick her up. "Want some presents, princess?" "Presents, Papa." "Presents, Papa," Joy said, clapping her hands. Tyrion gave her a beautiful book full of pictures of animals that were brightly drawn, while Jenna gave her a large stuffed lion that dwarfed the one she already had. Jamie had gone with a rather impressive painting which depicted a smiling Joy which seemed to fascinate her, especially after her father told her who it was. Kevin gave her a number of really cute outfits which John knew she could use. She went through clothes quite quickly, given both her growing and her ability to put said outfits through an incredible amount of punishment. Each of the children gave her small toys, some very beautifully hand-carved, and she excitedly grabbed each one and held it tightly, before throwing it down to the floor when presented with the next one. Geryon's present was a set of inks and papers, and John looked at him to see him smirk. He knew exactly the kind of chaos she'd get up to with him, and he didn't seem the least bit sorry for it. When it came time for John's present, he quickly left the room, and with help from Aliers carried it inside. It had taken a moon for the carpenter to make it, but the job he'd done was incredible. The horse was an almost perfect likeness of Winter. Its coloring and mane made it look like his own horse's foal. Its base was curved, so that if you sat on it, you made it move. He had gotten the stable master to make a saddle and reins for Joy to hold on to, and as he moved it towards her, he could hear her voice. "Orsian. Arsian. Your horsey Joy. Mine," she said excitedly. He helped her up onto the horse and handed her the reins. He fixed her legs into the stirrups and strapped her in tight, then stepped away. She looked at him in confusion, clearly expecting him to sit behind her like he'd done on Winter. "You ride Joy," he said and smiled as she did so. "Horsey," she shouted happily, as it moved backwards and forwards. A couple of moons later, Tyrion, when they had arrived at Castamere, they had encountered some problems. Firstly, the caverns of the mines themselves were long and narrow and full of uneven surfaces. The simple truth was, the system they would use would not work. Tyrion felt disheartened. Even though they had been making progress with the trading deals, the mines at Castamere would have been the greatest boon his family had known for a generation. Jon, though, took it in his stride. He and Ghost walked around the entrance to the mine. They entered and walked in as far as they were able to before leaving and walking to the lake itself. Tyrion watched on, wondering what was going on in the boy's head. Jon stood at the lake for what to Tyrion seemed like an age before finally returning to him, the expression on his face one of determination. "Can we stay here a few days, my lord?" Jon asked. "I don't really see the point, Jon. As good as your idea was, it's not going to work." "I know, I can see that. Please, just bear with me, my lord." "Very well. I'll have the tents set up. 2 days. Jon, that's all," Tyrion said. They spent the next 2 nights camped in the outskirts of Castamere Castle. Tyrion had wanted to stay in the castle itself, but in the end decided against it. He actually enjoyed the campsite. It was simple, and Ghost seemed to enjoy being out in the open, the wolf running off into the nearby woods and returning every so often with a rabbit or some small bird, which he'd drop at Jon's feet as if to say, "Clean this for me." In the evening they'd talk, and Tyrion would notice Jon looking wistfully at the mine entrance, almost as if he was lost in some memory or other. Sometimes they'd need to call the boy's name a little loudly, so he'd turn and pay them attention, while at others it was Ghost who grabbed the boy's notice and forced him to turn from where he'd been looking. He had put it down to disappointment over things not working out, and had tried to reassure the boy that no one thought less of him because of it. The windwheels still had potential, and the boom they'd received from them was still bound to be a lot. But Jon would just smile, as if he knew something Tyrion did not, and at times he found it disconcerting. "Well, it's time, Jon. I said 2 days. I don't think we should waste any more here," Tyrion said early on the 3rd morning. "Aye, very well, my lord." When they had returned to Casterly Rock, Jon had spoken to Jaime and asked if it was possible to take some time from his lessons. He still sparred in the morning and evening with Jaime and spent his time with Joy. But Tyrion noticed when he wasn't with Winter, he was either with Harlow the blacksmith or Malin, who was one of their carpenters. Finally, after a sennight or so since they came back, Jon came to see him. "What can I do for you, Jon?" Tyrion asked, looking curiously at the large pieces of parchment the boy carried. "My lord, I think I've figured out a solution." "Jon, it's fine, we've moved on. Castamere was a good dream, but the windwheels are incredible. We'll do well with them, my boy. No need to worry about the mine," he said as reassuringly as he could. "No, my lord, it's not worry. I see what was wrong now. This will work," Jon said and handed Tyrion the parchments. He looked at them, unable for a moment to make head nor tail of them. There were a series of long, round objects hollow in the middle. They were connected to bellows which were operated by the windwheels. The drawings were incredible, and Tyrion wondered when the boy had learned how to draw so well. As he looked the pictures over, he began to see it. Air, instead of being forced in by the bellows, was actually sucked out. This caused the object to fill with water which flowed up, and then emptied into a large trough-like tray, and flowed down the tray into what he assumed to be a lake. "Can this even be made?" he asked, pointing at the hollow object. "Aye, Harlow's already made some. I wanted to show you the drawings and ask if you'd like to see it working." "Aye, Jon, I would, I really would," Tyrion said excitedly. They made their way to the small well where Malin was waiting for them. Tyrion looked on as Jon showed the man on the pictures how to connect the bellows to the round object, and then he placed it in the water. Once he did that, they hooked the windwheel up to it. They waited for a few moments, and Tyrion was stunned to see the water begin to flow out. Jon nodded to Malin, and the man did something to the bellows which made it blow quicker, and the water flowed even faster. When he did something else, it slowed yet again. "Jon, I don't know what this is. This is incredible. This will work, I'm sure of it." "I think it will, my lord," Jon said, and Tyrion smiled at the boy. A moon later. It had taken them almost a full moon to make the objects, which they'd called pipes, the bellows and the connections they needed to attach to the wind wheels. Moving it to Castamere and setting it up took another night. Now as they stood there, all that work was either going to be paid off or be all for naught, and Tyrion could feel his heart race at the uncertainty of it. He looked down to where Jaime and Jon were standing along with Jerian. He could see the same trepidation in his brother and uncle's faces. But Jon seemed calm and collected, almost as if he knew this would work, and they were all nervous for nothing. He had to admit he admired the boy, his youthful surety. He could remember when he saw the world like that, anything being possible and whatever you dreamed could happen. But he was older and wiser now, and knew that wasn't always the way of things. He quickly looked around to see where the white wolf was. The damn thing had a habit of sneaking up on you, and it was bad enough that he'd scare the wits out of you, but for some unknown reason he always wanted to play with him. He assumed it was play anyway, since he was still here to tell the tale. He sighed in relief when he couldn't see Ghost, the wolf obviously off in the woods somewhere. "We're ready, my lord," Malin said. "All right, fix the last fitting together, and then we'll begin," he replied before making his way to the rest of his family. "It's damn impressive, Tyrion. You've done an incredible job," Jaime said as he arrived beside them. "It was Jon's idea." He smiled at the boy. "Aye, but you built it, my lord," Jon humbly replied. "Not to be a doomsayer, but we don't know if it'll work," Jerian said, shaking his head. "It'll work," Jon said determinedly, and both he and Jaime looked at him together. He watched as the wind wheel spun quickly. They truly were impressive things, and he had already sent some out to some of their Leal lords. He had found that not only did they work as pumps for water or as small windmills, but there was no telling what you could power up using them. Lord Crakehall used his to power the bellows for the forge. Lord Baneford had simply used his to bring his grain stores into the castle itself, allowing for them to be milled there rather than in nearby windmills or watermills. Tyrion knew, though, they were still only scratching the surface of what they could do with these things, and that eventually they'd come up with a use that would make them laugh at how they'd wasted them until then. He heard the noise of the wheels and the whoosh of air from the bellows. Time seemed to stretch on for a few moments. Before they finally heard the sound of running water, they looked to the tubes and saw the water flow into the lake. "It works. It damn well works. Good job, Jon," Jaime said excitedly, patting the boy on the back. They stood there watching for almost an hour as the water flowed before it finally stopped. It took them a few minutes to realize that the bellows inside needed to be realigned, so they decided to head off for something to eat. When they came back, the water was flowing again. On and on it went. Occasionally, the flow would stop and then after a while begin yet again. "Malin, unhook the fitting," Tyrion shouted. "Aye, my lord," Malin said and did as he was told. "Men, that'll be it for tonight. There's food and drink ready for you, so go get some rest. You did great work today," Jaime said loudly. After the men had left, they made their way inside the mine to see how far they'd gotten to. Tyrion was stunned to see that they'd removed almost half the water inside. It couldn't have been that simple, could it? He wondered as they walked through the mine. "I can't believe this," he said, shaking his head. "You're not the only one." Jerian laughed. They looked around the mine, Jon and Jerian walking off in one direction, while he and Jaime stood where they were. He could already see veins of glimmering gold. As they moved on, they came to something he had hoped not to see. There were skeletons and broken bones scattered on ledges that the water had uncovered. He shuddered The Rains deserve better than this. We'll need to give them a proper burial, maybe hold a service of some sort," Jaime said, and Tyrion shook his head in agreement. "We can get the Septon to hold a large service. It'll show people we're different than Father, and that the mines are open once again." Tyrion said. "Aye, we'll do that. Do you think those wheels could be used to help with the mining itself?" Jaime asked. "I think so. We'd need to create some tools that fit, but they'd be stronger than men and probably safer too until we figure out just how stable this mine is," Tyrion replied. "We'll need to restore the castle also, but it looks like we'll be well covered gold-wise. How rich do you think this mine is?" Jaime asked as he looked around. "Very," they both heard their uncle's voice say as he and Jon walked up on them. Tyrion looked in astonishment at the large rock Jerian was holding in his hand. The gold was shining, though he had rarely seen such a large deposit so freely available. Jon was carrying a similar-sized rock, except his looked different. He handed it to Tyrion, and as he did so, Tyrion could see it was silver ore. He had no idea the mine had both. This was an even bigger boon, as now the more rocks they uncovered, there would be less. That would be useless, it would seem. "Where did you find these?" he asked. "There's a passage. The back there the ghost uncovered. You need to see it. We're gonna need to put some guards on the entrance here right away," Jerian said, and began walking back the way he came. He grimaced as the white wolf came over and grabbed his leg, pulling his breeches as if to make him follow. He looked to Jon to see the boy smiling at him, Jaime joining him, and he realized there was no help to be had from that quarter. So he gave in and followed after the wolf, joining Jaime and Jon and walking down the tunnel to the right. When he reached the passage Jerian had spoken about, he could see exactly what he meant. They had obviously been working here before his father had flooded the mines, and they had hit a very rich vein. It was incredible. He watched as Jerian held a torch, and the gold glimmered in the light. A sennight later. In the end, it had taken them almost 4 days to fully clear the mine of water. The last bit extremely time-consuming, as the pipes couldn't function correctly with so little water, so they had to remove the final bits of water by using small cups and buckets. They also had begun to collect the bodies of those who died in the flooding. Tyrion was shocked not only by the number of them, which must have been in the hundreds, but in the horrible realization that some were clearly children. It was one thing growing up and hearing about what his father had done. It was quite another to see the evidence of it so clearly. As hard as it hit him, it hit Jaime even worse, and Tyrion was certain that the next person to play that damn song would feel his brother's wrath. In the end, they'd removed almost all of them. He was sure and true to his word. They'd held a service where the remains were blessed by the Septon and given a proper burial. Some of their lords had come from far and wide to see the mines reopened, and he knew that more than one had hoped to get the honor of both being placed in charge of the operation and the seat of Castamere itself. But Jaime had surprised them all and named his uncle Jerian, the new lord of Castamere, much to the man's annoyance. "I don't want it. Why would I give it to someone else?" "It must be you, uncle. You're not only the best man for the job, but you deserve this. You can rebuild the castle and make it a worthy seat." "Jaime, I don't want a damn lordship. I'm happy where I am. Why would you give me this?" Jerian asked angrily. "It's not just for you, uncle. It's for Joy also." "What?" "When she grows up, uncle, she may not have our name, but she's a Lannister, and I'll not have anyone look down on her because she's called Hill. So this is for her as much as you. She'll be the Lady of Castamere. Her name won't matter because she'll be richer than any of the damn fools," Jaime said determinedly. Tyrion had smiled as he thought back on the conversation. His uncle had come round, and Jaime had called Kevin in to see him before they announced it. He sat there waiting for Kevin to come in. Jamie and John talking excitedly about something or other, what he wasn't quite sure of as he hadn't been paying attention. But if you use a shield, would it not limit your movement? John asked. Aye, it would. But the protection it offered would be better. Better than a short sword? Aye, for protection. Yes. A short sword might help your offense, but it'd leave you open. Tyrion reached over and took a sip of his wine. Of course it was about fighting, he thought as he laughed, neither of the two paying him too much attention, engrossed in their conversation, as always when it came to swordplay. Finally, their uncle arrived, Lancel following behind as usual. The boy had been better lately. Tyrion was glad to say whatever little competition he had going on with John in his head clearly forgotten. Uncle. It's good to see you, Jamie said as Kevin took a seat. You too, nephew. This is an amazing thing you've accomplished. It wasn't me, Uncle. It was John's idea and Tyrion saw it through. Then let me congratulate you both, Kevin said with a nod. Uncle, I wanted to talk about Castamere. I know you were hoping to get it, so it's not to be me then, Kevin said disappointingly. No, Uncle. It's to be Geryon. He'll be the Lord of Castamere. Good. He deserves it, Kevin said with a forced smile. I have larger plans for you, Uncle. I need you elsewhere in a much more important role. Tyrion watched as his uncle sat up a little straighter, the anger and disappointment on his face replaced with a more curious look. I shall serve wherever you see fit, nephew, Kevin said. I know that, Uncle. I'm extremely grateful for it, believe me, which is why I'm naming you Lord of the newly created seat of Lannisport and Admiral of the Lannister fleet. My lord, you honor me, Kevin said, the shock and gratitude genuine on his face, Tyrion thought. No, Uncle. Now will you join me in a glass to celebrate our good fortune? Jamie said as he handed him a glass that John filled. Aye, I will, nephew. I thank you. Truly, you have no idea how much this means to me. Tyrion joined them in, and one glass led to more. Kevin was not one for drinking really, but he celebrated like a man who'd been given a lifelong dream, and Tyrion felt that he deserved it more than most. He looked to his brother, who smiled at him. Jaime rewarded people for what they did, what they achieved, and Tyrion knew his brother would ensure he got his due when the time was right, and so he happily celebrated with his family. Jon. The dreams had been coming more regularly since they returned from Castamere. Some were strange and of places he could never imagine. Large buildings that reached as high as the eye could see. Roads that made the King's Road look like a trail in the woods. He saw shapes cut into stone that seemed impossible. Animals that he could not name depicted to such detail that he could see their eyes glisten as he looked at them. Sometimes he'd wake up in a cold sweat and for the life of him couldn't remember the dreams at all. Others he'd remember vividly. He had been worried about speaking of them to anyone, fearing what they would think of him. So instead he'd curl up beside Ghost and eventually fall into a dreamless sleep. Sometimes it would be nights between the dreams, and at others they would occur every night. The ones which bothered him most were of a woman alone in a tower covered in blood. She'd look him in the eye, and Jon would feel his heart break at the look of pain in her eyes. He'd wake from those with tears falling down his face, and Ghost would lick them clean and curl tightly to him. Kill tightly. To him, other dreams were happier, of a man and a woman's laughter, or a beautiful song played on a harp. He'd occasionally dream he was walking the rock, smaller and lower to the ground, while around him people seemed as big as giants. Eventually he decided to grab some parchment and quills, and the things he remembered he'd draw or write down. An image of a blue flower covered in ice, or a sword shining with a light so bright it hurt to look upon it, a field of ice with the largest weirwood he'd ever seen, a cave filled with stone so black it looked like night itself, and a door made of stone that beckoned him forward. As he woke this morning, he quickly grabbed the parchment and began to draw what he dreamt the night before. He'd been by a dock as a ship sailed in, larger and more imposing than any he'd ever seen before. It glided through the water, and all of a sudden he was on board it, walking up and down, seeing ropes and sails and masts and men. He drew it all and placed it on the pile of other drawing he had on his table. "Well, Ghost, seems like this wasn't a bad one, eh, my friend?" he said as the wolf just cocked his head to the side. He quickly got dressed and made his way to break his fast. Passing Joy's room, he sighed. Ever since her name day when she turned 3, the little girl's lessons had gotten busier. With her father away, John had thought he'd get to spend more time with her, but Jenna had taken the little girl under her wing, and while he was happy for her, he also missed her, especially in the mornings, as she now broke her fast with Jenna and her children most morns. "Morning, John," Alessia said to him as he entered the dining room. "Morning, Alessia. How are you feeling today?" "I'm much better, John. Thanks for asking and for you help with the maester." "Don't mention it. I'm glad to help." He smiled at the girl and made his way to the table, unhappy to see he was alone. Jamie had stayed in Lannisport with Kevin, and John had hoped to go with him. But instead, he'd been asked to help Tyrion, which he had enjoyed. But it meant he had missed their morning spars for a couple of days, and Tyrion was rarely up when he broke his fast. He smiled at Alessia when she brought him his meal. The girl had been ill, and he'd gone to Crayland to get some help for her, knowing that servants weren't a priority for the maester. After finishing his meal and making sure the hungry wolf beside him had eaten his fill, he thought about going to see Tyrion. But he knew it'd be another couple of hours before he awoke, especially with him having worked thorough most of the night, so instead he went back to his room and sat back down on the bed. His lessons wouldn't begin for another few hours, and he was at a loss what to do. So he picked up the parchment he'd drawn that morning and looked at it carefully. The ship was incredibly impressive, but it didn't seem right. Taking another piece of parchment, he began to draw it out again. He completely lost track of time, drawing picture in picture of the ship, discarding one after another for reasons he couldn't be completely sure of, the pieces of used parchment mounting up on the floor. "Gone. Oi. John." He turned surprised to see Tyrion standing there in his room looking at him worriedly, while Ghost, for a change, sat in the corner, not paying the man any attention whatsoever, almost as if he too had been lost in his own world. "My lord? Are you all right, John? I've been calling you for a few minutes while you were just sitting there drawing." "I'm sorry, my lord. Got carried away. I had an idea and I just couldn't let it go." "An idea, eh? Well, your last idea made us rich. Weren't you already rich, my lord?" John JP getting a smile from Tyrion. "Fine, richer then." "Then," Tyrion said, sticking his tongue out at him, making him laugh. "So let's see this idea then." John handed him the piece of paper and waited for the laughter to start. If Tyrion knew he'd spent most of the morning drawing silly pictures of ships, he'd never live it down. But the laughter never came. Instead, Tyrion sat down hard on his bed and looked at the picture over and over again. "How did you come up with this?" Tyrion asked. "I don't know, my lord. I had a dream and I just drew what I saw." "John, have you any idea what this could do if it works?" "No, my lord. Wait. What do you mean if it works?" "John, if this ship is viable, you've just created something incredible. Sailing these ships would make incredible profits, not to mention how much of an edge they give in battle. I need to show this to Crayland. Come with me." The two walked to Crayland's rooms, Ghost finally realizing it was Tyrion that they were walking with, and once again deciding that Tyrion's britches were a tasty snack. "Get off me, you stupid wolf," Tyrion said, trying to shrug Ghost away. "Ghost, leave him be," John said, and the wolf stopped but looked at him like he was the biggest spoil sport ever. "Why does your wolf continually need to eat my clothes, John?" "He's just playing." "Aren't you, boy?" John answered while he rubbed the wolf behind the ears. The three of them arrived at the maester's and knocked before entering to find the man busily scribbling down notes. "My lord, John," Kralin said as he quickly took to his feet. "Maester, I need you to have a look at something," Tyrion said, handing him the drawing. The maester took the drawing and began to go over it in great detail, shaking his head and smiling occasionally before he turned back to them. My lord, I've never seen anything like this before. It's incredible. If I may ask, where did you get it?" "Young John here drew it, maester," Tyrion said, and Kralin looked at John, stunned. "My lord, this would change the way fleets work, for trade, for warfare. Ships like this would completely change it all." "So you think that it can be built and would be worth doing so?" "Of course, my lord. We should be doing it as soon as possible. It'll take a lot of work, but it can be done. I have no doubt it'd work, my lord." Tyrion looked at him and shook his head before smiling. "Come, John. It seems we need to make a trip to Lannisport. I want people working on this immediately." "My lord, if it's possible, would it be allowed for me to share this?" John asked. "With who, John? I wouldn't want to strengthen our rivals." "With Lord Manderley." "My lord, they've been good to me since I've come here, and I owe them. And what's that saying of yours again?" John said with a smirk. "Olenna." The last moon was incredibly trying, she thought, as she sat in her garden eating from her cheese plate. The little flowers sitting around her were chattering annoyingly, and not for the first time she wondered if she should just dismiss them all. Sitting to her left, her granddaughter was wearing the white wolf brooch she had received for her 8th name day. It was a beautiful thing, Olenna would admit, but it was the boy who'd gifted it to her that was causing her most of her concern. When news had reached them of the boy's achievement in reopening Castamere, Olenna had for the first time she could remember been completely lost for words. How a boy of her granddaughter's age had managed such a thing was beyond not just her, but Highgarden's maester, and she knew those other grey rats at the Citadel had tried and failed before, much to the old lion's chagrin. "How is this possible, Maester Lomis?" Mace asked. "I don't know, my lord. I've never heard of such a thing. Wind wheels small enough to be built and constructed on the move. It's never been done before." The maester said, shaking his head. "Do you understand what this means, Mace?" She said, already knowing the answer. "No, mother. I don't." Her son shook his head, and she shuddered. "It means this boy has just made the Lannisters richer than ever, Mace. What will they do with that money?" "I don't know, mother. Maybe they'll try and buy influence with the king," Mace said, looking at her both in hope that he'd reached the correct answer, and fear that if he had and what that would mean to their plots. "No, I don't think it'll be that." She shook her head. "They already had influence and gave it away for some reason." "Then what, mother?" "I don't know, Mace," Olenna said angrily as her son quivered slightly at her tone. That was the thing. She had no idea, and as most things regarding both the Lannisters and Jon Snow had lately, it bothered her no end that she could not see the game they were playing. Her mind went back to the young man in question. She knew off course that he and her grandchildren had been friendly, and that he was, as any young man would be, enamored of her granddaughter, even if at his age he wouldn't understand why. It had bothered her to see that her precious Rose felt something similar for the boy, though given the distance between them and the fact of their ages, she hadn't felt the need to keep them apart just yet. When the boy had come to the wedding, she had been surprised, but the boy was courteous and respectful, and the gift he'd given young Lanesi was thoughtful. Even Olenna had been impressed. After the wedding, she had noticed her granddaughter was a little more subdued than usual. But after a while she had come back to being more like herself, and Olenna had put it down to travel. And the fact that back at Highgarden they had no big events planned for a while, she had quickly rectified it and held a number of balls, and noticed that her granddaughter's mood soon improved. When her name day arrived, Olenna had thrown the largest feast she could to ensure her granddaughter's happiness. They had given her incredible gifts, jewelry, books, dresses, fabric, and yet once again it was a bastard boy's gift which was the most cherished. "My lady, a gift from a friend," the man said, carrying a small box to her granddaughter. "I thank you, sir. May I ask the friend's name?" Marjorie asked. "Of course, my lady." The lad said his name was just John. The man said, and Marjorie's smile beamed at him. "Good, sir. Please enjoy the feast." Marjorie turned and opened the box. "Look, Grandmama," the girl said as she walked towards her, holding the brooch in her hand. Olenna had to give the boy credit. The brooch was exquisite, simple yet elegant. The eyes were two small garnets, and the wolf's body was made from ivory. The pin was made of gold. Simple yet striking was the best way to describe it, and her granddaughter adored it. When she'd found out who the gift came from, she'd almost taken it away from Marjorie. It was one thing to be friendly with a bastard, quite another to accept gifts from one. However, in the end, she'd said nothing, and when she heard of the events in Castamere, she felt vindicated in her choice. The boy was someone who could, in time, be a good friend to her house. And if he felt something for her grandchildren, and Marjorie in particular, all the better, far easier to manipulate a friend than an enemy. "Grandmother, are you well?" Marjorie asked concernedly. "What's that, Sweelbling? Are you well, Grandmother? You seem a little distracted." "Oh, it's nothing, dear. What are you and your friends talking about?" "We were just speaking of attorney, Grandmother, wondering when Father may hold one." "I'm sure if you ask him, Sweetling, he'll hold one soon," Olenna answered, and noticed the look in her granddaughter's eyes. Mace would be holding attorney very soon. She knew now, and she smiled. Her thoughts once again turned to Jon Snow and the Lannisters. She was getting nowhere. She'd set some of her spies up to gather what details they could on either, and not one had brought her back anything of note. The Lannisters were moving into trading more, and now with the additional income from Castamere, would no doubt seek to invest it, which gave her some openings, she thought. But it was Jon Snow himself that really interested her. She needed to know more about the boy. Her efforts to find out who his mother had been were so far unsuccessful, with Ashara Dane seeming the most likely given both the boy's looks and his father's reluctance to name the woman. Honorable Ned Stark would never speak badly about the dead, she thought to herself. She had spoken to her grandsons about the boy, and they all had said the same thing. He was someone they liked, and in some cases it seemed admired, as both Garland and Loras spoke fondly of the spars and the duel itself. Even Willis, who was much more sensible than either of her other grandsons, had nothing but good things to say of the boy's temperament. She needed to do something, or this would drive her mad. Marjorie. Yes, Grandmother. Loras got on well with young Jon Snow, did he not? She asked, already knowing the answer. He did, Grandmother. Jon's easy to get on with. Marjorie said, smiling. Do you think he'd be open to squiring for Jaime Lannister? Do you think he'd be open to squiring for Jaime Lannister? Do you think he'd be open to squiring? I think he would, Grandmother. But Jon is already squiring for Lord Jaime. He is, but surely an important man such as Lord Jaime would be able to have two squires. And with Jon and Loras getting along so well, I'm sure they too would enjoy each other's company. She looked on as her granddaughter looked confused before she nodded at her. Good. She looked on as her granddaughter looked confused. Before she nodded at her. Good, it would speak to Loras, and she'd work on Mace. Loras no doubt would be quite eager to be trained by a man such as Jaime Lannister. Boys and their swords. She snorted. She would speak to the boy before he left. There would be no need to tell him to get close to Jon Snow, that it seemed was already done. Instead, she'd insist he send letters back, let them know how things were going, what was happening at the Rock, and how he and Jon were getting along. She'd learn more from Loris's letters and visits than she ever would from spies. She reached over and grabbed a particularly nice piece of soft cheese and placed it in her mouth. The taste of it divine, and the headache she had been nursing for a while started to fade away.